Hey everyone, and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about my second most anticipated book of the entire year, Not Till We Are Lost by Dennis E. Taylor. This is the fifth book in the Bobbyverse series, and once again, this is a series that I absolutely love and is a great time. If you are somebody who likes Project Hail Mary, The Martian, those were both by Andy Weir, Murderbot, it would be another good example. If you like kind of those fun, lighthearted, but with enough sci-fi in it to still, make it a good time, this is the perfect kind of series for you. To give you the general premise, if you're not familiar with the series starts with Bob. And Bob is an engineer of sorts, and he signs up to have his brain stored in a digital format if something were to happen to him. Well, big surprise, 15 pages into the very first book, Bob dies. His brain is, transported and put into a computer, basically, and we kind of evolve the story from there, and Bob basically becomes a reproductive robot up in outer space where he can clone himself and kind of split into multiple different Bobs, and that is how the story begins. Now, obviously this is book 5, so I'm going to have some slight spoilers for some of the earlier books at some point in this video. I'll mention those before I go into them too much, but in general, if you are a fan of, like I said, The Martian, Project Hail Mary, Murderbot, this is going to be a series that you absolutely are going to enjoy. It has great humor, it has great characters, and it does explore some really fun scientific concepts in a way that is not too hardcore sci-fi. Like, you're not going to need to know the equation of the diameter of the, how to figure out the diameter of the sun or something like that. But there are going to be like bigger general sci-fi concepts that are explored and I think done really well. And each book kind of tackles a little bit of a different one until the point where you have multiple different storylines going on at one time. And that is done because even though we start with one main character, Bob, like I said, he can reproduce into, well, reproduce is a funny way to say that. He can split himself and clone himself and create many, many more Bobs. And that is kind of one of the key concepts of this entire series. And I think it is something super unique and gives this series a unique setting when it comes to characters, because the characters are technically kind of the same. And this is one of the many concepts that is explored in this series, is this the drift between clones, right? Is if one person clones themselves, is that clone the exact same as them, or are they slightly different? That drift is something that gets explored, and obviously once there's more than one clone, they have different experiences as they explore the universe, and they kind of become their own individual people. And that is one of the many things that, like I said, is explored and is extremely fascinating. But what that does is it gives all of these characters a single connection point back to Bob. And so while they're all slightly different, they are all still slightly the same. And it is just a unique experience. By the time we get to this book, there are many Bobs, right? That thousands of Bobs, and seeing how they all have different interests, how they interact differently with each other, ones that are closer with each other, ones who are maybe not so close with each other, is one of my favorite things about this entire book. Because like I said, even though they're technically they started from one character, they could not be more different in some aspects. And I think it makes it a really interesting concept that I've never seen done anywhere else, mostly because, I don't think another book has ever had one character clone themselves into thousands. At least I'm not aware of it. I'm sure somewhere in sci-fi this same kind of concept is had, but in the way it is done here, it is just masterfully done, and it's one of my favorite things about the whole series. The characters here are, actually, I won't even say that they are stronger than the plots in some of these books, but the mixture of the characters and the plots just make this one of my favorite sci-fi series. This is probably my third favorite sci-fi series. It and The Expanse are really close. I think the highs of The Expanse are a little bit higher than the highs in the Bobbyverse. So maybe that's kind of, it would go Three Body Problem, The Expanse, Bobbyverse. So that's very high praise for me. I absolutely adore these books. And so now let's get a little bit more into this book itself in context of the whole series. So this is where some slight spoilers from earlier books might come in. I'm not going to spoil anything too big, but I'm going to, probably have to reference some events in the earlier books. So from Heaven's River, that kind of felt like an ending to me. I feel like the series could have ended. There were a couple threads that I definitely would have liked to see, be explored a little bit more. But in general, I think that the series could have ended there at the end of book 4. I'm glad it didn't, because I wanted more, but I think this book kind of suffers from the syndrome of it's kind of having to start a new arc. I really think that you could look at this book and be like, this is the next arc in the Bobbyverse. I think on an extreme end, you could almost start reading the Bobbyverse in this book. You would be missing out on so much context, so much like inside jokes and in a lot of things. Like, I would not recommend that. But I'm saying if you randomly picked up this book and started reading it, you'd be a little confused. You wouldn't know, some of the political maneuverings that are going on, how certain characters feel about each other, some of the history that they have with each other. But in general, I think you could kind of get through this book and be like, yeah, I still had an okay time with it. That might be a little bit of a hot take. I'll be curious on what anyone else has to say about that. But because this feels like a new arc, it feels like so much is being set up for the next book that I think it kind of brings this down in my rankings a little bit. I did end up giving this book itself a 4-star ranking, and I probably have this as my second to least favorite. Heaven's River was my least favorite of the books, mostly because that book went on for way too long. But this one is a slight step up, but it is not the same highs as some of the earlier books, unfortunately for me. And I think the main problem with it is the characters are still great, the humor is still fantastic and all of that, but some of the plot points that we got here felt like they were specifically going to be for the next book. Actually, 2 of what I'm going to consider the 3 main plot points are for future stuff, in my opinion. So I'm going to briefly talk about those plot points. The first one will be the one that I don't think is going to play the biggest future moving forward. It maybe could. Maybe there will be some ramifications for some of the things that happen, but I'm going to call this plot point the dragon plot point. So the Bobaverse in general has a history of exploring an alien planet and alien culture. All of Heaven's River is basically about that, right? We spent all of our time with the Quinlans, and that's like the whole book, right? Well, we had that before again with the Deltans, and we have that same thing again this time, and this time it's with dragons. It's explored by 2 characters who I won't name, that feels like too much information. But this is one of the plot lines where I feel like this could have been a novella. Like, I think Dennis E. Taylor could have extracted this out, made it a novella, like a short novella in of itself, and I would have enjoyed that plenty. Obviously it fit into this story and everything, but I really feel like it didn't need to be here. I will be curious on if maybe there are some ramifications that happen to the 2 characters that were involved in this plot line, but in general, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think this will just be another example of adding another species character to the Prethula. Wow, that was not how you say that word. To the array of characters and creatures that we have. It really just seemed like, okay, we're adding another one, so we'll have to see what really happens here. This felt like the one that didn't really need to be here the most. Now, the next 2 really do feel like they are from the next book, and it makes me really hopeful for the next book, but it doesn't really help this book all that much. And the first one is going to be, I'm going to call it the AI plotline. So we know that there's a group of Bobs who is obsessed with making like the perfect AI or whatever, and obviously that is a thread that is continued on into this book, and stuff happens with it. Not going to spoil what happens with it, but everything that happened with that seems like it's going to pay off somewhere down the line, who knows? But to me, once again, this is another one of those plot lines where kind of showed interactions between Bobs and everything, which is great. I love those interactions and some of the things that they talk about and explore. But in general, this once again just kind of felt like, man, maybe even this one could have been a novella. Maybe it was a novel that could have been novellas, and maybe that's kind of a realization I'm coming to right now. So that is like news to myself. But once again, this feels like it kind of could have been its own thing again if you just reworked it a little bit, which is a big thing to ask an author to do. But once again, this feels like it's going to be for the next book. And the last plotline, which was my favorite, I'll call this the wormhole plotline. This was definitely the thing that gripped me the most as far as plots go throughout this entire book. But once again, this feels like something that is being set up for the next book. Obviously, we get a huge reveal at the end of this book, and the wormholes plotline is kind of how we get to that point. But once again, probably could have been a novella, probably could have maybe paid off a little bit more in this book. I mean, we do get some really important stuff for the Bobs from here, and like I said, it was definitely my favorite plot point. But in general, I don't know. It just feels like these were all a little disjointed, a couple different threads, and there's technically a 4th plot point, I guess, with the Quinlan-verse that I don't know. It just really didn't feel like it needed to be there all that much. It's fine that it was there and everything, but it didn't really do all that much for me, and that's kind of where we'll go with that. There are definitely some political things that are happening between all of these plot lines, and I'm not saying that these aren't woven in very well together and that this isn't a great book. I really had a great time with this book, but sometimes it's easier for me when I really enjoyed a book to really point out the things that I didn't like and points where I think it could improve than on a book I'm more in the middle ground with, because I just am kind of about it in general. And so when it's a book I really like, I feel like I have this ability to really pick on it more than if I didn't like it as much. So I do just want to say that, because I feel like this sounds really negative when I'm very happy with this book in general. Like I said, this is a 4-star book, a top 100 book all time for me. Even though it's a lower ranking than some of the other Bob books, it's still one of the better books I've ever read. And I would totally recommend you guys to read it because it's a great time. The series in general is a great time. But those are kind of the plot elements to it. I will say, they are woven together well. The story is coherent. It's not too long. It doesn't overstay its welcome or anything. And I think that is one of the biggest things about this book. I think if this book was, I did it in audio, so if it was another 4 hours, I really feel like it would have been bloated. Kind of how I felt about Heaven's River in general. I feel like Heaven's River was a little too much. And so this kind of pulled back to the normal Bobiverse length, and I really appreciated that, and I think it made it, stay high in my rankings, because if it was a little bit more bloated, I don't know if I would have felt the same way. I do just want to touch on the characters again. I'm very attached to so many of the characters here that no matter what, being back in this world, being back here with all of the Bobs was going to be great, and there's not much more I can say about them. I feel like they are who they are. I don't think too much has really changed. There are some things that very slowly, there seems to be some political changes that are happening that maybe concern the Bobs some, but that was just hinted at just enough that I don't know if that's a future Bob's problem or a problem we'll never even get to explore, because I don't know how many Bobiverse books there are going to be left. I think we're getting a little meta here, but I think the author only has one more of these books on his contract. So my assumption is that the next book is going to probably try to tie as much of this up in a bow as it possibly can. So I'm curious on how some of these things are going to mature and be a part of the story going forward. Obviously, I think with the big reveal at the end, we might get some... Actually, I'm not going to say that. I don't want to spoil anything. So if you want to know what I was going to say, definitely let me know down below in the comments. But in general, another great Bobiverse entry book. I really hope we get the next one sooner than later. And I hope that you read this if you haven't. And if you have, definitely talk to me down below in the comments. I'd love to talk spoilers with you down there. But that's all for me. And as always, have a good one.